Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Uh, Post New Year's, first 2023 edition of This Is Not Advice. So, welcome back, everybody. We're going to do another one of your questions about work. If you're here for the first time, we answer your questions about work. I'm Roy. I'm a startup investor in the future of work, and I'm here with my colleague Lori. And we've been doing a little bit of a series on something we know about, which is being VC. And so today for day 345, Lori, take it away.
Awesome. Well, Happy New Year, everybody. I love that we're jumping right in, getting back on topics of how we can all kind of be better. And especially for this question, I'm really excited to talk about it because it's something that I ask our team a lot about, and I feel like I've been learning so much about. And it is, as a VC, how do you and how should we all start thinking about supporting founders in our portfolios, right? And by the way, I'm really excited to hear specifically what you think about this kind of in this small format, because you've been talking about founders as a priority for so long. So I know that you have a million things to say, and I think it's fun to see what you'll squeeze into this short time.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Well, it definitely feels important as an investor. The reason I got into this was I felt like when I was a founder, I was like, this can't possibly be the best way to support um, founders the way VCs do it. And
Yeah.
so I was really eager to try to do it differently. And, as you know, and we've talked about here, we kind of think of the investing process. It's like find people to invest in, decide whether to invest in them, win the right to invest in them, and support them. And VC is unique because, or maybe unique is the wrong word, is rare among other forms of investing because we're mostly focused on helping our investments win as opposed to assessing them. So it's not like a public market investor where you buy a position and ask management a bunch of skeptical questions and you're not really there to assist them in any way. I mean, maybe the effect of your questions is that they get better, but it's different. So, and we think of this as, for us, the core of what we do. Like, we start at the back of the funnel, like any good product company might. This is the back of our funnel, and it also produces the references that earn us the right to invest in other founders, and and we hope improve the value of the portfolio. So, the first thing I just start with is, what's the default model? The default model was VCs decide whether to invest, and then they just kind of try to help as much as they can, but it's more around the edges. And their main form of help is pattern recognition and advice, meaning being asked for things and saying, well, I've seen 8 other companies. But the truth is, there are many reasons I think that model fails. One reason is that N is very small for any VC, like as big as their pattern recognition might be. Maybe they've had 20 companies in a fund. Most VCs, and there are exceptions, Y Combinator is an exception, but most VCs have pretty small N. The thing is, most founders just don't want advice. Like, they tolerate advice. Sure, I mean, everybody wants good advice, but they tolerate receiving advice like, oh, really? You think I should read about what my competitor's doing in TechCrunch? And it's called the eye roll moment. This is what I call the eye roll moment of they're groaning on the inside. And that was what we wanted to avoid. And I think it leads to the first thing, which is, how can you tell if you're supporting founders well? Because, well, I seem to have a good relationship with my founders. Like, well, they kind of need to show that they do. And so they're not going to be super honest about that most of the time. It's not fair to expect them to. Like, you have power over them. You can approve things like future funding rounds. And surveying them, we've done NPS as our main way of telling whether or not we are serving founders well. And it's good. It's better than doing nothing. And certainly I've had plenty of founders say, like, you're our only investor who even asks us for feedback. But still, the responses are generally very positive, and people, I think, are hesitant to be honest.
Yeah.
So
you're not getting the true critical pieces.
That's right. Or you might not get all of them. And so I assume that we're not hearing. And so that has 2 implications. One is try to find every possible way. I assume we're not hearing the most valuable of the critical feedback and assessment of us. So that means 2 things. One is try to invent new ways to get that feedback. And so our support for Founders Choice, the founder ranking system, is one way of doing that. And the other is tune your ear. So if you hear even a tiny little bit of something critical, you assume it's actually a mushroom cloud of lots of negative feedback and go in and really mine it. So, for example, we had a case a few years ago where founders said some comment in passing about secondary, about being allowed to sell secondary and how like maybe we weren't, like maybe we had mixed views on it. And like every investor, like we have views on it. It's not always a sensible thing to do. It can misalign incentives. But I made sure to like really chase that founder down and be like, hey, it seems like there was something there. Can you tell us more about that? And it's painful to hear this feedback. The only case where I don't want to hear feedback is when I think good faith has broken, basically where I think the person has more of an interest in criticizing us than giving us feedback to improve. And that's only happened once or twice in the last almost 10 years. By the way, 2023, 10-year anniversary year for Bloomberg Beta. So that starts with that. It's how do you know if you're doing a good job? And then what I assume.
Well, and sorry, before you keep moving on, I do want to point out something that you do really well on that last topic, which is asking for feedback in the moment when it might seem like the person isn't open to giving it, right? And so meaning when we're talking to a founder and we're having it back and forth, it might seem a little bit kind of like we're talking about something hard and they're just kind of listening, taking it in, taking that as a moment to say, and how do you feel about that? You know, we are not the end all be all, and making sure that there's that open communication throughout and not just when there's that something wrong.
Yep. Thank you. I mean, one principle of how I do that is to lean into the awkward. Like the second moment comes up where it's like something's happening here, the natural human temptation is to look the other way.
Run away.
Train yourself like founders run toward the fire. When you're a VC, that's the fire. You got to run into the building. And so even if you might get burned, like that's where the baby is that you can save, or something like that. I don't know, not the right analogy. And then
the metaphor went all over.
A little much. And then as far as like the core model for serving people, I just think get them to make asks and act on their asks as fast as you can. So like, and as well as you can. And usually what's really valuable to them is like introductions. Hey, I need to meet this journalist. Hey, I need to meet this customer. Or it's like closing candidates. Hey, will you talk to this candidate for us? Not opinions. It's almost like what helps them not improve the quality of the work they're doing, which can be great. And if like I think Don Valentine, the Sequoia VC, said something like 1 insight every 10 years for a company and you're doing great. And maybe that could be profound and true. And I think maybe has been true at times, but more like they know what they need. If what they need is for you to pick up the groceries, pick up the fucking groceries. Right. And so just invite them to keep making asks and then act on those asks as rapidly as you can. Now, I'm not going to pretend that we're a 10 out of 10 on that. We're always still working on how to get more efficient and effective. But it starts with that. And then...
well, and sorry, before we move on, question on that, which is, what do you think the best ways are to ask for like what they need from us?
Just to repeat yourself. And so, to say from the beginning, make asks. Like our kickoff meeting with founders is like, okay, it ends with what are your asks for us? And if we get an investor update that doesn't include asks, we're like, where are the asks? And you don't want to create false asks because, then that's kind of nonsense. People can do kind of performative asks, if you will, if you push too hard. So like anything else, it's timing and dosage.
Right. Like you don't want to be asking, kind of what can we do for you to the point where they're inventing work, right? To make us feel good.
Sometimes founders will say something like, well, I have this resource. It's my responsibility to use. And it's like, no, it's not. Your job is not to maximize the use of all your resources. It's to use your precious time to get the most value you can as fast as you can for the company. And, we had this last night. A founder was texting with me and James, and then with Karen as well. And she was asking about getting on the phone to talk about something. And James and I was like, sure, let's do it. And James, and I texted in the sidebar, and he was like, why are we doing that? Like, didn't we already solve the need? It's like, well, yeah, but she's asking. It turned out he was asking about something else. But she was asking for time. And it's like, okay, let's give her time, and if it gets to be like it's not effective, then you can always double back on that. But the reason so then I think it's transitioned to the second point, which is oftentimes as an investor and just as a human being, you do have beliefs that maybe a founder ought to be considering doing something differently. And the question is how to offer that valuably. And so I try to put myself in the position of if they had hired me to be on their team, how would I offer this position? I wouldn't do it from a perspective of like, I'm more knowledgeable than you are, and here's what I think you should do. I would approach it, first of all, with humility that I probably don't know what the right answer is, and they've probably considered the thing. And you don't have to like overly self-flagellate, but just be aware of that. And in this case, I was worried that the founder was approaching a situation too defensively and that they might actually turn this thing into a moment for making progress as opposed to just limiting downside. And I might have been wrong in that intuition. That was what had, James and I were talking about. But I thought I might be right. And so I said, look, maybe you could think about it this way. And it's sort of offered lightly as a possibility. There's a really big difference between you should totally do X, which, by the way, I'll say if I believe. And one of my challenges in giving this kind of input is I can speak as if I am very confident, even when I've encountered that. And so I've tried to learn that and tell people that and remind them, but still it can create an issue. But to just approach it from the perspective of, a coach who I know once said this thing to me. She was coaching somebody who is like one of the most respected CEOs in the world. And she and her friend said, how can you coach him? Like, he knows everything and you don't know everything. And but she said something really insightful. She said, he's on the top of this mountain and he can see the whole world, but I can see him. And so,
oh, I love that.
Any outsider can see a situation and just offer data. Hey, based on what I'm seeing, it looks like this to me. I don't know if I'm right. I don't know if I'm wrong, but you deserve to have my data. You deserve to have what's, we talked about the Johari window in the context of feedback of moving things from like my private arena into the shared space, private arena back in my head. It's just like that. And then I also, very last thing I'll say is I don't attach anything to whether a founder, or I try not to, whether a founder actually takes advice that we give. I've had founders years later say like, we did this thing you suggested and it worked or it didn't work. I'm like, I really don't remember. And part of that, a lot of these lessons came to me from shitty things other VCs did to me as a founder. One of them was like, I told you so. It's like, you know what? Fuck you, asshole.
Yeah, like who did that help?
Yeah, exactly. In general in life, but also like you're in Bali, you're hanging out on the beach, fucking tweeting at me at what I should do. And we're the ones doing the hard work and running out of cash here. So just trying to remember that there's an asymmetry in that relationship and to put the power back in the founder's hands. So those are some of the things. It's test to really make sure you're getting the input on whether you're doing it well. Start by serving their needs. Sometimes I think about that 5-to-1 ratio that people talk about in relationships of 5 positive comments to 1 negative comment. It's almost like 5 times you just do what they ask for every 1 time you get to say like, what about? And then, don't hold your tongue and just try to approach it in a constructive way with self-awareness.
Yeah. And specifically on that last point of really sharing it as a data point, right? And understanding that like they can use this as a data point as well as anybody else's opinion. And ideally they're taking in all advice as a data point and they're in the driver's seat.
Yeah, and look, things happen. Like some people try to triangulate advice, and we want to discourage them from doing that. And Lori, one of the questions that comes up that we've talked about too is, you and I are at different stages, different places, different paths in life and career. And so, how do you serve a founder is very different from how I serve a founder, just because we're different people. And so, for each person who's a VC, figuring out what are the areas where I think if they hired me on their team, could be particularly helpful. And it's like, well, you have your network of people who you know, and you have your skills, in your case, product management. And you've also worked in both an ad tech environment and a database technology environment. And so just making sure to be aware, and most people overthink it. They want to come up with some big sweeping thing. It's like, honestly, somebody who's just really good at knowing how to format spreadsheets would be an awesome use to a founder. I'm not suggesting that's what you should do. But
right. It's a good example though.
Like something tiny of like, I took your financial model and I just reformatted it in something more standard. Like something like that can be wildly valuable. And sometimes it's the little things, like for example, this person on LinkedIn, getting your founders in 30 under 30, the Forbes list. And it's like, they're kidding. And it's nice of them to say this, but like really sometimes you do have access to that special thing. Like, hey, I heard about this meeting with like, I remember the chairman of some big Indian conglomerate was coming to San Francisco, and it's like, okay, buddy, like we'll set you up with these 3 founders. And sometimes that's an unexpected thing you can do that as a VC, you've hired me on your team. I have relationships you don't have, and I'm going to put them to work. And sometimes those are progress. So
100%. And I feel like that also is a good reminder, especially to any emerging VCs, about the fact that we all have strengths and that you don't have to invent new ones. Like most of the time it's already within you. And yes, you can develop it as you go along, but leaning into what you're already good at
and deciding what you're not good at. So like I'm terrible, and we as a firm are below average at sourcing candidates. My memory sucks. I don't have good systems for it. It's not quite my community of like, starting engineers. So I just try to wear that on my sleeve. And it's like, look, I also happen to believe founders should be doing mostly their own sourcing. I don't think it's good for investors to do that, to take over that function as some investors do. But also, we're just not that good at it. We can't figure out, we only try to do the things where we think we can be best in the world at doing things in that way. I'm curious if in your, first few months of doing this, if there are questions that have come up for you about, like, for you yourself, of how do I serve a founder in this, or examples of something you're like, I tried this and I think it worked or didn't work.
Yeah. Well, and I think going back to I'm thinking about kind of how we have thought about hiring, right? As an example of sourcing for companies. And even though we know it's not something we're strong at, it is something that we take a step back and think about often, right? We think about, is there a way that we could improve and help? Are there new technologies we could use? Like, we don't necessarily write it off as something we'll never do.
That's
But
right.
as we reprioritize, we think about, okay, can we be exceptionally helpful at this? Yes. Okay, let's look into it. No, we're going to put it on the back burner for now. So I think that's like a great thing that we do as a team. I think for me, as I've gone along, something that's worked really well is just trying to connect to founders through their updates and seeing how I can help with the context of me as a person. And so, for example, like, there's a founder who, we went back and forth about something that she needed with hiring. And then what that ended up happening was, I was somebody who she could come to when she was struggling with that hire, right? And when something was going bad, not necessarily for advice, but just as hiring is hard. And I 100% know and feel that pain. And being that person who can be a sounding board is something that at this moment I'm able to help with.
Totally. And, I think I just add to people's imagination of ways to support founders. Some of it can be practical, but some of it can be emotional. Some of it is just like, you know what? I just had chemistry with this person and they seem to trust me and want to open up to me. And especially if you have a VC team that has multiple people, well, there are going to be things that some people, if you and I work together in supporting a founder, as to do, there are going to be cases where the person feels more comfortable with me and cases where the person feels more comfortable with you. And that allows us to kind of complement those sources of support. I also really love your insight, and I think it's so valid, that we're reconsidering all the time, and also the nature of what support is useful changes across time. I mean, press contacts are less useful now than they were 9 years ago. Social media wisdom is maybe more useful now. Retweet. I mean, I can't tell you how often what a founder really wants is just a retweet, and that's okay. Like, that's fine. Or what they want is to come on This Is Not Advice so they can share something. Fine, like whatever it is. But it evolves over time. The relationships that are important evolve. Like, I remember when getting somebody 100K in AWS credits was like a super thing to do. Now it's like every VC with their salt can do that, snap their fingers and do that. And so the world changes too, and therefore the nature of the support that's needed, the trade craft of starting companies, like all that evolves.
100%. And like, to your point earlier about inviting founders places, I think targeted invites to events is also huge, right? Like, oh, you're interested in this space. I have this invite for you. And now you're making connections really just by forwarding an email.
Yeah. And, as you say that, it just makes me think for each of these areas we've talked about, I think the mental model I've been imagining is what I guess I'd call one-on-one support, direct dialogue. You can also systematize this stuff and build assets where it's like, we now have a verified vendor list, so we don't have to make those introductions. When it's time to invite somebody to an event, we look at past event invite lists. And so trying as a VC, as any professional, to systematize the things you do repeatedly so they take you less time when you repeat doing them, and you can do them at higher and higher quality, is something that applies just as much to the back of this funnel. I mean, on some level, we are just a little business that sells money to founders and does customer success work.
Can you believe that we've made it this far into the stream without talking about how we connect founders to each other? That just occurred to me.
Good point, which is there is, probably the best asset we have is now the community of founders. And I know we're upgrading like our founder Slack experience and stuff like that. But you're right. I mean, founder to founder value is usually bigger than VC to founder value. And so that's probably the single most useful thing we do. And founders, we ask them what's useful and they tell us and we listen or try to.
Well, awesome. This was so great. So jam-packed.
Yeah, I love it. I feel like we could do like offshoots on each of these.
Really?
To be continued. And for folks who want to find more, you can always find past episodes, and some of them are now transcribed. Maybe we'll get GPT-3 to help us on thisisnotadvice.work. And then you can also find the short version at Jam. You can just put in jam.ai and find us there. And the reason we call it This Is Not Advice is because we don't really know what you should do. You know, UVC trying to figure out how to support founders. We can offer what we can do, but usually advice is, you know, the perspective of the giver. So we'll hold our own lightly. And to be continued, Lori. Thank you.
Thank you.